C.S. Lewis, someday you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. And I am one of those people who never stopped loving fairy tales. I came across this reel that had 4 authors tagged, and when I saw their profile, it all looked so magical and enchanting. And it made me wonder how we humans are so obsessed with escaping life as it is through magic and dreams. Isn't that why we still love fairy tales and movies like Harry Potter so much? At least I do. I'm obsessed. The mystery, the magic, the color, the darkness, yet the light, the old fashioned, old music, old places, old art. Everything is so visually stunning and mesmerizing. And I have probably over romanticized every single frame of it. This week was my sister's birthday, and to celebrate, we went out for lunch and spent the evening by the lake and had a lot of fun. The climate was super nice, not super cold, but just cold enough to enjoy. I have shared few clips in the middle of this video. Also, I saw few people catching fish from the lake, and it was really nice to see that. Hey guys, so today I will be reading you A Vampire in the Village, Transylvania, 1898. The moon shone on the empty village square. Most villagers were tucked up in bed, but 16-year-old Clara was wide awake. She lived at the top of her father's noisy inn, so she rarely went to bed before midnight. It was now after 1. As the muffled singing rose up through the floor, Clara gazed out of the window. A shadowy figure in a black cloak was creeping across the square. He looked like a man, but not like any man she had ever seen. His skin was white as ivory, his eyes flashed green in the dark, and his lips were stained a ruby red. The figure was surely moving faster than any human being could. Then all of a sudden he was gone. It must be a trick of the light, Clara thought, but as she got into bed, her mind kept whirling. Could it be a vampire? Don't be silly, she told herself. Vampires are just an old wives' tale. As a young girl, she had listened eagerly as the old woman of the village told tales of these creatures, and she found herself remembering snatches as she tried to sleep. They are monsters who look like handsome men and beautiful women. They drink human blood by night. They have no reflections. A vampire leaves only 2 tiny wounds in his victim's neck. Eventually, after much tossing and turning, Clara fell asleep. The next thing she knew, it was morning and someone was shouting, "Dead! It old Mr. Goga, he's dead." In a panic, Clara dressed as quickly as she could and ran downstairs, her skirts flying out behind her. The whole village was pouring out into the square. Clara rushed to where the village policeman was standing beside the lifeless body of Mr. Goga. As Clara leaned closer, she saw 2 tiny puncture wounds on the old man's wrinkled neck. She shivered. "Be off with you, Clara," said the old policeman. "This is no place for you." Clara scurried away. What should she do? She had no doubt at all that Mr. Goga had been killed by a vampire. But who would believe her? And even if some of the older, crazier ladies of the village believed her, who would believe them? So Clara kept her suspicion to herself. Then, very late one evening, a few days later, a young man came into the inn. He had no hat, Clara noticed, and his coat was very old, but despite his scruffy clothes, he was handsome, though pale. His eyes were bright green and his lips were far redder than a boy's usually are. He strode up to the bar and Clara's father bustled over to him. "How can I help you, sir?" he asked. "I am looking for information about the murder of Mr. Goga," said the young man. His voice was quiet and serious. "I heard he was killed a few days ago. I need to know how." Clara's father stared at him suspiciously. "It's a family business," the man added. "Oh," said Clara's father, in a more sympathetic tone. "You must be a relative of the late Mr. Goga." Clara's father leaned forward. "I am sorry to tell you, but his body was drained. No blood left at all," the doctor said. "There were only 2 little wounds on the neck." The young man nodded, as if that was what he had expected to hear, then turned on his heel and headed for the door. "Excuse me, father," said Clara, grabbing her cloak and following him. "I have to go out for a while." "Wait, where are you?" called her father, but Clara had already gone. Outside, Clara had only taken a few paces after the young man when he turned to face her. "Why are you following me?" he asked. Clara blinked, surprised that he had heard her, but she couldn't help blurting out the question that was burning on her tongue. "Did a vampire kill Mr. Goga?" "Yes," the boy's tone was matter of fact, "and I am going to hunt him." He pulled a wooden stake from his coat, making Clara gasp. Clara trembled at the thought of the vampire out there in the night, but she couldn't let the stranger go alone to defend her village. "I am coming with you," she said. "I am Clara, by the way." The boy smiled for the first time since she had seen him. "Victor," he said. Clara grinned too. "Do you have any more of those stakes for me?" Victor shook his head but pointed to the crucifix around her neck. "Use that. It will keep you safe from the vampire." Victor led her up into the dense woods behind the village, bounding up the steep path like a mountain goat. She couldn't possibly keep up. and her lungs felt fit to burst after a few minutes. "How do you know where the vampire is?" she asked him. "I have been tracking him for a long time," said Victor, "but stop, we are there." In the moonlight, Clara could see the outline of a huge stone house. They crept through the back door of the house into a long corridor lit by torches. Victor put his finger to his lips, but the warning wasn't necessary. Clara was already creeping along like a timid mouse, jumping at every little noise. As they reached a grand, dimly lit hall, Clara caught sight of herself in a large mirror on the wall. Where was Victor? A surge of panic went through her and she spun around. But Victor hadn't gone anywhere. He was standing by her side, and yet he had no reflection in the mirror. A horrible thought sprang into her mind: vampires have no reflection. Then, as she looked into Victor's own bright green eyes, she remembered the green eyes of the swift moving vampire she had seen the night before. "You are one of them," she cried. Victor grabbed her arm. "Please, get off me," Clara cried. She wriggled away, tearing her dress, and ran down the corridor, slap bang into a figure in a long black cloak, freezing vice-like hands around her wrists. A horrible smile spread across his face. Up close, his skin looked so pale it might as well have been painted white. "I see my son has brought me a snack," he said. The vampire spun Clara around so she could see Victor, who was standing not far away. He had a dark scowl on his face, but he said nothing. The vampire threw back his head and laughed. The sound made Clara shudder, but as he laughed, he loosened his grip. Clara saw her chance. Pulling her hands free, she grabbed her crucifix, pressing it to the vampire's cheek. He let out a terrible screaming hiss. Smoke billowed up from his face. The vampire staggered back, howling, and Clara began to run. Victor lunged forward. She thought he was going to grab her, but instead he pulled out his stake and plunged it into the vampire's chest. With a final scream, the vampire vanished into a cloud of dust. Clara stared at Victor. "I don't understand. Why did you do that?" "He's your father. You're a vampire." Victor shook his head. "Not quite," he said. "My father was." He looked at the pile of the dust a little sadly. "But my mother was human. I am what is known as vampire. I take after my father in some ways," he said, "the reflection, my strength." "But you didn't inherit his taste in food," said Clara cautiously. Victor smiled for the second time that night. "No," he said. They strolled out into pale morning light, arm in arm, silent for a moment. Then Clara asked, "What next?" "I'll continue my hunt. These mountains are crawling with vampires," said Victor. He paused. "Perhaps you'll join me?" "Perhaps I will," said Clara. As they walked together down the mountainside, Clara felt excitement fizzing inside. Of course she'd join him. There was only one thing still troubling her. How on earth, she wondered, am I going to explain this to my father?